Hello, my name is Adam Huff, and I'll be giving a presentation on the vocational training in the American education system. I'm following along with my presentation here on the computer, and I'll submit both those files. So, what is vocational training? It's education and training that prepares prospective workers in a particular area and skill needed to enter the workforce. So, common examples of it today are carpentry and construction programs, mechanic classes, welding, cosmetology, culinary arts, and more recently, business and graphic design are just a few examples of vocational training. Some schools have extensive vocational programs, others offer very few. It seems to vary from school to school. So a brief history of the vocational training in America. The earliest forms of vocational education were actually apprenticeships, where a master of a certain skill would kind of adopt an apprentice, and they would learn the skill and the trade through him or her. Now, the differences of this and some of the reasons for its downfall is that they weren't closely monitored or regulated. There was no apprenticeship council. There was no regulation for the certification of apprentices. It's just when they learned the skill well enough to perform it on their own, they were on their own. They didn't get any sort of degree or certificate. And they focused exclusively on teaching that skill. If it were welding, they focused on welding. If it was a blacksmith, they only taught how to be a blacksmith and so on. They didn't focus on academic training in terms of English, reading, writing, or math, except what was necessary for the skill. So as America became more industrialized and there began to be a bigger focus on labor regulations within the industry, and things like certificates started to matter, apprenticeships started to fall by the wayside. Even as that happened, though, as that started to happen, there was no proportional increase in vocational training in public schools. When public schools were first established here in America, they focused more on university prep, getting people to college and universities, and they were attended mostly by the upper class and the elite families. And so despite the apprenticeship program falling, vocational education wasn't exactly replaced in the public arena. At least at first. But as time went on, it became an issue that rose to the top, and there were several reasons for that. One reason was fear that we were falling behind other foreign powers in the labor market, or other of our foreign competitors that did focus more on vocational and technical training, and they were producing superior workers, and those better workers were contributing more to their economy, and there was fear that we were starting to fall behind. There was a series of 3 reports published by the Committee on Industrial Education. In the 1905 report, they studied and extolled the virtues of the German technical and trade education. They quoted as saying, "The German technical and trade schools are at once the admiration and fear of all other countries." They recommended that we should try to emulate that program and really focus on vocational education. The 1912 report suggested that America had seriously neglected the development of human capital, which is essentially teaching its people and workers and raising workers that grow up to be competent contributors to the economy. And that while we had done well in the property market and other things, we had seriously neglected the human capital market, and we were up to 25 years behind foreign competitors. At the same time that was happening, due to the reasons discussed on the previous slide, there was an influx of low-income students into the public school system. Due to the increase of factories and industrialization, typically children that would have stayed home and learned trades with their parents or helped with their families on farms or things like that. Instead, they were being pushed into the public school system. So the public school system was faced with not so much of a crisis as much of a choice. And rather than incorporate those students into the academic track, many schools started focusing on developing a stronger vocational education system to kind of push the flow of low-income students towards that direction. So the third report that came out, I mentioned that there was a series of 3 reports. The most pivotal in terms of getting the ball rolling for vocational education was the 1914 report of the Commission on National Aid to Vocational Education. This was a major contributing factor to the Smith-Hughes Act. The 1914 report was actually quite a landmark, not just for vocational education, but for education in period. What the goals? So what the 1914 report claimed was that focusing more on vocational education would reduce the waste of human resources by not spending, but by making sure that kids are being trained in an appropriate career for them, then that we would waste fewer educational resources. It claimed that we would be better equipped to meet the individual needs of students, that we would provide more equal opportunity for all, and I'm going to circle back to that one in a minute. It claimed that we would be able to develop a better teaching process because vocational education is more hands-on, and so they advocated learning by doing. They claimed that it would reduce discontented workers because they would be trained better. They would be better prepared for the workforce. And of course, they argued that it would increase American human capital, which would decrease our dependence on foreign labor markets. Up to that point in history, it was much cheaper to hire skilled laborers, foreign skilled laborers, rather than train our own. But we knew that that wasn't a sustainable practice. And so training our own became a priority. I mentioned equal opportunity. What this act helped to do was really redefine the idea of equality of opportunity. Up to that point, equality of opportunity was thought as giving everybody the same thing, giving everybody the same education. And in that way, they would be on equal footing or equal ground. But what this did is redefine that in the sense that it would give everybody an equal opportunity according to their skills or according to their abilities. So it was a much more personal type of equality, and it actually became one of the driving forces of education over the next century, was that idea of equality of opportunity. This 1914 report also led to the passing of the Smith-Hughes Act of 1917. Now, this was one of the first major federal milestones for vocational education. It directed funding to all of public schools specifically for the development of vocational programs, and it established a federal board for vocational education, and their responsibility would be to study the labor market and come up with best practices for schools, all public education, on how they could implement and train vocational workers. So in addition to that, and to the vocational education side of things, the other half of that was vocational guidance. It became apparent that as we revamped our vocational education system, that we would need more guidance counselors and to help those students enter the appropriate courses of study. So the purpose of vocational guidance was to help match students to an appropriate career and move them to the corresponding educational track. The goal was to reduce waste and inefficiency in education and in the distribution of human resources. So as was mentioned earlier, by more exactly matching a student to their future career, the hope was that we could give them a more targeted education and waste fewer resources. And so the role of a vocational guidance counselor was developed. And it was actually quite a unique and complicated role. For one, they were expected to know the labor market very well, so they knew what there was a need for and what possibilities were out there. Of course, they were educators. A lot of these were teachers / counselors. Some of them were full-time counselors, and a lot of times they had to be psychologists. They had to understand the personalities and the minds of the people they were helping. Another effort for vocational guidance was the development of junior high schools. One of the primary reasons that junior high schools were developed and instituted was that it was supposed to be a system that would help facilitate the vocational guidance of students. Their hope was that between the 7th and 8th grades, through testing and other methods, that they would choose the appropriate path, whether it be academic or vocational, and they would be placed on the appropriate educational track early by 7th and 8th grade in their education. So a few of the major players, the change agents in vocational education, one of them was Calvin Woodward. He founded one of the first, you could call it vocational training schools. He called it the manual training school. They didn't, and it was important because it was one of the first, but his theories didn't really last. One of his methods was that rather than focus on a particular skill or a particular trade, they just focused on physical abilities and manual skills that would help them in general in the workforce. So it was important because it was one of the earliest, it was one of the first, but it eventually gave way to more targeted training. These next three that I want to talk about were all on the vocational guidance side of things. And I did that purposely because the vocational education, having that in place, was important, but it wasn't really until the vocational guidance system became functioning that it was used to its full potential. So one of them is Eli Weaver. He was one of the pioneers of the vocational guidance system, and he actually advocated for the establishment of a vocational bureau agency whose job would be to facilitate between high schools and the labor markets. His idea was that this agency would communicate with the labor markets so that they would know which jobs are in most demand, and they would be up to date on the latest training and regulations, and then communicate that with the high schools to make sure that the high schools were teaching the best trades of the time. For example, if they needed electricians, if there was a shortage of electricians, the school would make a push to train more electricians. And on the other side of that, if there was not a need for carpenters, they would scale back on their carpentry education. So that was his idea. It never came to fruition, but he really pushed for that. Another was Frank Parsons. He was referred to as the father of vocational guidance. He was one of the first to use personality and self-analysis tests to determine for what career his clients were best suited. So rather than just looking at the job market, he also looked at the student, or the clients as he called them, to match them up for the best career. And the last name is Hugo Munsterberg. And I think he wasn't an educator per se, but he was a psychologist that developed some of the earliest mainstream vocational aptitude tests. And I think that's important because those are things that we still use today. Not his tests, but aptitude tests are still used in many schools. In almost every school, they use those types of tests just to see what students might be interested in. So he developed some of the earliest of those. A few lessons to learn from the history of vocational education is that often vocational training has a tendency towards academic inaccuracy. So since the focus of vocational training was to prepare them to enter the job market, there was little and sometimes no focus on academic studies. So what they ended up finding was that the students of vocational schools were ill-prepared to go to college, which wasn't a problem at first because that was never the goal. But as the job market started to change and skilled laborers were in less demand, or at least skilled laborers were in less demand, it became more important for them to go back to college and to further their education, and many of them were ill-prepared to do so. It was also found that students of vocational schools were severely lacking in their math and English skills compared to their peers who attended academic-based high schools. And so all of this started to change with the No Child Left Behind Act. What that said is that in order to receive federal funding, any given state had to test all of its students annually, and that would include students of vocational schools. So in order to get that funding, once they started doing the testing, they started to see that in certain areas their vocational students were significantly behind. So this resulted in a blending of academic and vocational education in a few ways. First, public high schools started to institute more vocational training classes. Another way was the vocational institutions themselves started to focus just a little bit more on academics, and some of the vocational institutions just ended up closing. Another lesson to learn is the concept of tracking. And this its origins come from the very, very beginning of vocational education, since one of the primary reasons that it was established was to a response of low-income students, a response to an influx of low-income students. And so those low income and often minority students were being shepherded towards vocational training. And that continued through the decades. Studies done throughout the 60s and 70s showed that low income and minority students were disproportionately being pushed towards vocational training. Things have changed today to an extent. It's not perfectly yet, but today most vocational teachers would complain that the students that are being encouraged to take vocational courses are the problem kids that academic teachers don't really want to deal with. But the phenomenon of minority students being pushed towards vocational training actually has disappeared. Recent studies have shown that there's no difference in minority students versus white students as far as vocational enrollment. And then a third lesson to learn and something to consider. Since 1980, the average number of credits being taken by a high school graduate has increased from 21 to 27. That's an increase of nearly 29%. And in that same time period, the number of academic credits has increased from 14 to 18%, also an increase of 29%. However, over that same time period, the average number of vocational credits earned per graduate has decreased by 1 full credit, which is a 17% decrease. So while the number of classes being taken has increased, the number of overall classes being taken has increased, the number of vocational classes, or now it's called technical training, being taken has decreased. And the reason why that is, what most scholars think, is that there's with increased requirements for graduation. And I can speak to my own experience in high school. There's room for electives for sure, but being on a swim team, that was a class period. I'm LDS, and so I took release time seminary, and that was a class period. And just between that and all of the required classes, I didn't have time to take any other electives. I took graphic design one year, and that was fun. And I've noticed the same trend and pattern in the students that I teach now. I coach the swim team, and that's a class period. So all of those students are already taking the swim team. Many of them are LDS, and so they're taking release time seminary. Many of them are in music, and so they're taking band or orchestra and things like that. And so even if they wanted to, there's just not enough time in their class schedule for vocational training. Okay, thank you for the semester. That was my presentation on the history of vocational education in America.